Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first of a four-part webinar series all about AgVet product access in Australian aquaculture. My name is Jasmine Knowles, and I'm an aquaculture veterinarian and have been based in Tasmania for the last 10 years. I have recently commenced an FRDC-funded project with Seafood Industry Australia, who are the national peak body for seafood, and we are providing coordination of access to agricultural and veterinary chemical products in aquaculture. And as part of this project, we are holding a four-part webinar series over the next 18 months to share information with aquaculture industry members and all of the other interested people who are online today about how these products are accessible to aquaculture farmers in Australia. Today's first webinar is designed to be a real introduction to the key concepts, and we'll build upon it in 3 future webinars that will go into more depth using some practical examples. So we're very lucky today to have Emmy Schutz from the APVMA joining us. She is an expert in AgVet product access and permits, so I'm really looking forward to her presentation shortly. And it looks like we've got quite a range of attendees online. We've got some industry people, we've got veterinary product suppliers, possibly a couple of PhD students and some other members of the APVMA. So hopefully this next 60 minutes is informative for you all and you learn an introduction to this access to AgVet products. So just before we get into things, Seafood Industry Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So just check that slides are moving along for everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So today's outline, you'll hear briefly from me about the functions of this FRDC project that we're undertaking, and then we'll get into the main presentation from Emmy, who is the Assistant Director of Permits at the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, known as the APVMA, and they are Australia's AgVet chemical regulator. Then we will show you how the APVMA Online Services Portal works, so how you can go in there and navigate some of the key functions and find out which products are currently permitted and available for aquaculture. And throughout this, if you've got any questions, if we can just ask if you hold them until the end or pop them in the chat as we go along, and we'll have some time to go through those toward the end of the presentations. And just a note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you all in the next few days, along with copies of the presentations and a few other resources that we have. So just a little bit from me to start off with. Australia has a real diversity of aquaculture species being farmed around the country. And like other farming industries, AgVet products are really important tools for the prevention and treatment of diseases, management of biosecurity risks, and for basic animal husbandry and welfare. And to give you some examples of the types of products that are used, we've got the Certivac vaccine, which is an injectable vaccine used in the prevention of pilchard orthomyxovirus disease in Atlantic salmon. We've got benzocaine, which is an anaesthetic that allows gentle handling of fish and abalone. It can be used for health checks when fish need to be individually inspected. And then sodium hypochlorite, which is a disinfectant that allows equipment to be decontaminated before moving between different farm areas in prawn aquaculture. So these 3 products are just some examples, but they're really important for the production of these species. And there are over 50 other products that are currently approved for use in aquaculture in Australia. So why is national coordination of access to these products needed? Well, firstly, access to these products is more difficult for aquaculture than for established terrestrial species such as cattle and sheep. There are almost no registered products available for our aquatic industries, and the primary reason for that is the low economic return for pharmaceutical companies to invest in registrations, because it costs a lot to register products here in Australia, but we actually are a relatively small market because the volumes are small, usually much less than for cattle and sheep. The uses can be sporadic, we might have variable needs from year to year, and we farm many different aquatic species, and some of them are quite new, so they're not necessarily proven use patterns for some of these products. And Australia also has many unique diseases that can't be catered for, particularly for international vaccine products. So without access to these registered products, we generally rely on minor use permits, which are issued by the APVMA. And Emmy will shortly explain in some more detail about how that works. But unfortunately, this minor use permit pathway does come with some barriers for industry members in particular to access. We've identified that there is a bit of a lack of knowledge in how to navigate the application process and fill the data gaps. And industry are not necessarily experts in the chemical studies and the data collection trials that are required. And there is an opportunity to really develop the capability in this area to ensure access to the currently permitted products is maintained and enhanced. So that's where this FRDC National Coordination Project comes in. And I just wanted to mention that this is also a national objective of Aquaplan. So Aquaplan is Australia's national strategic plan for aquatic animal health. And specifically, Activity 6.2 aims to develop a nationally coordinated approach to facilitating minor use permit applications. So this project is very much in line with national priorities. So we've got a number of aims, and they're to be achieved through 4 key objectives. Firstly, we want to maintain access to the products that we currently have and secure funding to help collect data needed for new minor use permit priorities. We then want to improve industry education. So that's knowledge on the safe and effective use of these products and the application processes to acquire them. Objective 3 is then to identify options for ongoing coordination. So after the life of this two-year project, how can we develop a transition plan so this is ongoing? And Objective 4 is all about capacity building, so embedding these skills within the industry. So I won't go into too much detail about any of this, but I just wanted to give you a feel for some of the things that we're doing in this project. So we're maintaining the current permits by creating a national AgVet product database. So this identifies all of the products that we currently have permitted for use in aquaculture species. And we use this as the basis to review what permits are coming up for expiry. We develop relationships with permit holders so we can assist them with renewals where required. And if there are any products that look like they're at risk of expiring or the industry losing access, we work with the relevant stakeholders to find some solutions to prevent loss of access. For example, finding some new permit holders to take over permits that would otherwise have expired. We also facilitate new permit applications by working with industry to identify priorities and access gaps and seek funding for new applications. There are funding sources available through the Australian Government's AgVet Assistant Grants program, and we participate in that each year to help get funding for new products. We then provide educational material to industry on the available products that we have, and that'll be in the form of an annual snapshot that talks about all of the permitted products that are available. We also have this webinar series, which is kicking off today, and we'll have a stakeholder workshop later in the year where we will target a specific group of industry representatives to upskill. And then the learnings from that workshop will be consolidated and shared widely to this group and to all of our other stakeholders, so everyone is able to learn along the way as we are. And finally, we are developing communication channels with the APVMA and facilitating engagement with the industry. And again, today is one of those opportunities with Emmy joining us, and there are many other capacity and capability building activities that we have planned throughout the project. So that's a real whirlwind summary of what this project's all about, and I just hope it sets the scene for today's introductory webinar, and I'm looking forward to continuing to assist all of our stakeholders wherever I can over the next 18 months of the project, and hopefully see this transition into an ongoing program that's sustainable for the seafood industry. So for the time being, for any assistance with permits for aquaculture or related topics, please reach out to me at this email address. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Emmy Schutz, the Director of Permits, Assistant Director of Permits at the APVMA. Emmy has a wide-ranging experience and responsibilities across the APVMA, which she can talk to us about, and she's going to share with us an overview of APVMA permits and registrations in relation to aquaculture. So I'll hand over to Emmy now.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hopefully everyone can see my slides and hear me okay.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Excellent. Right, so thank you for that introduction. Before we start as well, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of their lands and their elders past and present. So we'll start with the basics. What is the APVMA? So the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority is the national regulator of agricultural and veterinary, or AgVet, chemical products. So for any AgVet chemical product to legally be manufactured, imported, supplied, sold, or used within Australia, first it has to be registered or permitted by us. So that means that any veterinary chemicals used by the seafood industry need to be assessed by the APVMA. So AgVet products are important for disease prevention. So for example, vaccines, therapeutics, so like antibiotics, husbandry, so anesthetics for animal handling. They have an important role in aquaculture. But AgVet products must be used safely to reduce risk to consumers, ensure market access, and to mitigate risk to the environment. However, we do recognise that full registration can be a costly and data-intensive pathway, and due to the relatively small size of Australia's aquaculture industry and some of the challenges that Jasmine mentioned before, there's limited interest by pharmaceutical companies for investment in product registration because the costs to generate data to support that product and the actual assessment for registration would outweigh expected commercial returns. And that's also exacerbated by the diversity of farm species in Australia and often a lack of Australian-specific data. So permits provide an alternative pathway to registration that still enables safe access to AgVet products in aquaculture. So when I say that AgVet products must be registered or permitted by the APVMA, what do we actually assess? So under our legislation, we're required to be satisfied with the safety, efficacy, and trade criteria. And this is the same for both registration and permits. So registration means a product is registered, uses are on label, and that registration is out there as long as the holder of that product pays their fees, it's out there forever. A permit, however, is a temporary permit to use either an unregistered product or a product off label. We still need to assess and be satisfied with the same safety, efficacy, and trade criteria, but the difference lies in the level of data that we accept and the level of assessment. So for registration, we have very stringent data requirements that are up to international standards. For permits, we recognise that for minor uses, that data is not always available. So we have different requirements for different kinds of data that we can accept. But in brief, when we look at the safety criteria, we'll look at the manufacturing and formulation of the product. So that would include things like how the product's formulated, the process to manufacture it, the shelf life for the product, and the containers that it will be supplied in. Basically, we want to make sure that, if something says it has 400 grams per litre on the label, that it has 400 grams per litre in the packet. We also look at worker health and safety, so the safety of people using that product. We look at environmental safety, so safety to basically anything that's not a person, any off targets. So if we're talking aquaculture, we'd be looking at safety in the water environment. We also look at residues and dietary exposure. So if a product is to be used in a food producing species, how much of that product might end up in that species if it were consumed? And then is that residue going to be safe to anyone who's eating that product? We also consider target animal safety. So if we're using something in a species to hopefully improve their health, we want to make sure that it's not going to have any negative effects. We then look at efficacy. That's fairly straightforward. We assess whether it does what it says it does, basically. So if it's registered product, we want to make sure that we can be satisfied with the label claim. If it's a use under permit, we want to know that when that product is used according to the permit, that it will be efficacious for the purpose under permit. And then the trade criteria, a little bit of an unusual one because a lot of overseas regulators don't consider trade. But because trade is so important to Australia's economy, it's something that we do look at. So we want to make sure that if produce is treated with an AgVet chemical and that is exported overseas, that any residues in those products are not going to prejudice trade between Australia and countries outside of Australia. So as I said, safety, efficacy, trade criteria, these are the same criteria that we use to assess both permits and registration. But the focus for today will be on permits, and specifically I wanted to talk about minor use, emergency use, and research permits. So as we discussed before, an alternative pathway to access veterinary chemical products is via the permit system. So we can either issue a permit for the use of a product off-label, so a registered product that's maybe an antibiotic that's registered in pigs, someone wants to use it in barramundi, we can issue an off-label permit for that use in a different species. Alternatively, we can issue permits for the use of an unregistered product. So a product that hasn't gone through any of that assessment process I talked about previously, it's not registered, we haven't looked at it before, but we can issue a permit for the use of that unregistered product. So a minor use permit means that use of the product or constituent would not produce sufficient economic return to an applicant to meet the cost of registration of that use pattern. So that includes cost of data generation and cost of assessment by the APVMA. Basically, minor use is there for situations where market size is too small, for niche uses where there isn't that economic return to justify registration. We also issue emergency use permits. So these are permits for situations that are unforeseen. So that could be a biosecurity permit. It might be a permit in case of an exotic disease outbreak, or if there's a product shortage. So for example, a registered product's available, but there's product shortage, which means that unexpectedly that's no longer available. An emergency use permit could be used to access an alternative. We also issue research permits, and these allow data generation. So any research use of an AgVet product needs to have a research permit, and they can allow data generation to support either a minor use permit, emergency use permit, or a product registration. And while we're on the topic of research permits as well, we do have a small scale research permit available. So that is permit 7250. You can look it up on our website. I think Jasmine will run you through the portal later, which will give you a bit of demonstration for how to find this if you need to. So this basically allows small scale trial work without the need to apply for a separate research permit through the APVMA. But to be eligible to use 7250, the work must meet the conditions of the permit. So that includes work that's within the confines of a research facility, or if it's outside a research facility, there's a maximum of 100 animals. There's also conditions around how treated produce will be disposed of, animal welfare requirements, and record keeping requirements. And while that is available, I will flag that it doesn't cover research involving genetically modified organisms, so GMOs, or veterinary biologicals outside the confines of a research facility. So if you are planning research, you can access that via our website, determine whether your research meets those criteria. If you do have any questions about it, you can contact us via our inquiries line, but do be aware that it does have those limitations around GMOs and biologicals. So then if we talk about actually applying for a permit, anybody can apply for a permit. Our main applicants are usually government groups, industry groups, or larger companies, but anyone is able to apply, even individuals should they wish to. To make an application, you need to lodge it online via our portal, and that involves creating a login, accessing the portal, and then we have a decision tree tool which will allow you to select the correct application type and the modules that you need, and you can put in all the information there via the portal. And then in terms of information that you need to provide, basically your basics, so company name, contact information, but also information on the use pattern. And here it's really helpful to provide as much detail as possible. So that includes the product you'll be using, whether it's registered or unregistered, especially in cases of an unregistered product, means information about the product. You know, what species you're applying it to, how often, in what circumstances. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about the actual data requirements later on in this presentation as well. But the other information that we need for a permit is how it meets the minor emergency or research use criteria. So again, going back to minor use, we're talking uses that do not produce sufficient economic return for registration. And we do have guidelines for how to determine that on our website. So for a majority of species in aquaculture, we do consider them minor species. That provides kind of shortcut justification in terms of meeting the minor use criteria, but there may be further information that we require around that. For emergency permits, we do need as much detail as possible about the emergency situation, and then any supporting data from state territory governments, CVOs, is helpful in us making that determination that it is an emergency situation. And then for research permits, just a brief description of the research, what's planned, I guess kind of the scale of the trials as well is really helpful. Another thing that we need to look at when we're talking about permits is that there are reasonable grounds for issue of a permit. So this is another one of our legislative tests, because the permit system is there to provide access to AgVet products where there is no registered use. The preference, of course, is for a product to be registered and to go through that full assessment. So where there are registered products available, ideally they should be used instead of a permit. So if someone is applying for a permit, we need sufficient justification that there is the need for the permit, that there are no suitable registered products for the use, or if there are registered products, where that permit fits in with the registered products, so that we can be satisfied that there's reasonable grounds to issue a permit for this rather than registering the use pattern. And with all of this as well, the more detail you can provide, the better. It makes our lives a bit easier on our end in terms of looking at the situation for use, whether it is a minor use or an emergency use or research, and those reasonable grounds as well. So after you submit your application, it goes to the APVMA. We have a preliminary assessment where we look to make sure that everything's complete. And then it goes to a risk manager for further assessment. And at that stage, we'll contact you if we need more information. But otherwise, it goes through the assessment process against all those criteria I explained earlier. So I wanted to give a brief overview of the general data requirements. And these do differ between unregistered products and registered product. And they do vary a lot depending on the type of product and the proposed uses, for example. But this is just a very general outline. So for registered products, so those are products that we've already looked at, already assessed. We do often have data in our holdings already to satisfy the chemistry and manufacturing aspects. We'll also have toxicological data that we can use to assess occupational health and safety and environment. So for registered products, the basic data requirements will be residues if it is used in a food producing species, but also target animal safety and efficacy. If we're looking at an unregistered product, then because we haven't seen this product before, the data requirements are a lot greater. So we need information on the chemistry and manufacturing. That includes both the active constituent and the product itself, how it's formulated, the packaging, etc. Again, residues for food uses, but then we need some occupational health and safety information. So that might be a toxicological data package. We'll need environment. So again, like ecotox endpoints or a data package, and target animal safety and efficacy, really important again. So this is just an overview, but if you are interested in like specific data guidelines, they can all be found on our website. And if there is a particular use pattern you are seeking registration or a permit for, we do offer a pre-application assistance pathway as well, where you can come into the APVMA and say, I want to use this product for this purpose. It's either registered or unregistered, and we can tell you what level of assessment would be required and the data that would be required to support that assessment. But what I do want to stress is that target animal safety and efficacy are important, especially for these kind of uses where there often isn't a registered equivalent use. So there is data guidelines on our website if you're looking for specifics about that. Something I did want to touch on is autogenous vaccines because they are a unique class of product. So these are immunobiological products that are manufactured from microorganisms isolated from an animal, which the attending veterinarian believes is a causative agent of the disease affecting that unit, and it will be used for the treatment of animals in that aquaculture unit. So basically, it's a custom vaccine that's manufactured to specifically target disease on a particular aquaculture facility. So it's prepared in response to a specific and immediate need, can only be used on the facility from which it was isolated. And the data guidelines for autogenous vaccines are a little bit different to the other some of our other uses. So it does require a chemistry and manufacturing data package, but efficacy data is not required. So because the association between the disease to be treated and the selection of the agent doesn't need to be demonstrated, we don't need that efficacy data package for autogenous vaccines, but it is the responsibility of the prescribing veterinarian to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the vaccine of the target species. So we can issue a permit, but there are a lot of conditions around that permit, how it's used, and it's up to the prescribing veterinarian to be satisfied that it is working as expected. Another thing with autogenous vaccines as well is that if there is a registered product available, the applicant for an autogenous vaccine permit should provide evidence or justification to support the claim that the currently registered vaccine is not achieving adequate protection against the disease in that particular situation. So again, it comes back to registration is a preference. If a registered product is available, they should be used, but in circumstances where that's not sufficient, there are alternative pathways. And again, there are specific guidelines on our website for autogenous vaccines. Another requirement I did want to mention as well, especially for aquaculture products, is good manufacturing practice. So all veterinary products that are manufactured in Australia must be manufactured in appropriately licensed facilities. Products manufactured outside of Australia are required to comply with GMP standards that are equivalent to those applied to Australian manufacturers. That can be a point of difficulty when applying for permits to use products from overseas, is the GMP equivalence. So there are a few options in terms of there are some standards that are recognised for the APVMA as being equivalent. There are also options to have an APVMA audit of overseas facilities. But if you're unsure again about GMP, it's something that I would suggest talking to the APVMA about before making an application, so we may be able to provide pre-application assistance advice. There is an exception for 100% active constituents. So if there is 100% active constituent, no secondary packaging involved, then we consider it to be an active pharmaceutical ingredient, so the GMP code does not apply. In cases for permits where GMP evidence is not sufficient, we do have the ability to place conditions on the permit to mitigate this, but this is in exceptional circumstances. We still need evidence that the manufacturing site can perform the steps of manufacture, but for some reason or another, a full license can't be provided. So we do have an example. There was a fish spawning product which was manufactured to an overseas GMP standard, but wasn't equivalent to an APVMA standard. However, due to the history of use of that product under permit, we're able to consider the fact that there were no adverse effects reported and be satisfied of the safety in that way. So this is more of an exception rather than the rule, but it does illustrate, I guess, some of the differences between a full registration where GMP would be absolutely strictly enforced and a permit where we do have some leeway in terms of data requirements. However, it is still an obligation for the holder and the users of that product to report any abnormalities, any adverse experiences if noticed after using the product. While we're on the topic of GMP, I just wanted to touch briefly on the difference between veterinary chemical products and agricultural chemical products. So the definitions up here, I'll let you read them, but these are definitions from our legislation. There are also some exemptions in our regulations. There are slightly different data requirements between veterinary and ag products for permits. The biggest one being that GMP, good manufacturing practice, does not apply to agricultural products. So I think most of the permits for aquaculture uses would be considered veterinary. So for example, permit 92731 down there for use of benzocaine for sedation anesthesia of abalone has a direct effect on the animal. That's considered a veterinary chemical product. But there are some circumstances where permits would be used for agricultural chemical products, such as permit 91180 for use of hydrogen peroxide as a general disinfectant where culture animals are absent. So in terms of providing data to support applications, best kind of quality data that we would like to receive would be dossiers from product manufacturers, and those would be to regulatory standards according to the guidelines on our website. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world, so we understand that that's not always possible to provide. We also accept data from overseas, so whether that's overseas data that's been used to register products in other jurisdictions or just data from use of product overseas, we can consider that. We'll also look at published scientific literature. Lab trials and field trials are really helpful, especially if they're performed in Australian conditions under similar conditions as proposed in the permit. And we can consider history of use as well. So for permits that have been out there for a while with a long history of use, we can consider that, including any adverse experience reports or lack thereof. So as I've outlined, obviously the data requirements between registration and permits are very different, but that's where permit conditions come in. So we can use permit conditions to mitigate risks that we might identify during our assessment process. So that might be by limiting the permit duration. It might be limiting the scale of use or who is able to use that permit or other conditions. So a new minor use permit is typically issued for 3 to 5 years, but it may be shorter if we can't be fully satisfied. So for example, if we have enough data that we're satisfied that something is probably going to be efficacious, but we need a bit more data to confirm, we might issue a minor use permit for 2 years and then advise the holder that further data is required for renewal. So when that permit comes in for renewal, we'd be expecting further efficacy data to help us confirm that those efficacy criteria can be satisfied. And we'd expect that to be submitted for renewal of the permit, and then we could consider issuing it for a longer duration. But there may also be other permit conditions. So as I talked about briefly before with the autogenous vaccine permits, there are a number of conditions on those permits that the product manufacturer and users of the product or prescribers of the product must satisfy. So that includes record keeping and monitoring requirements, but we could also place restrictions on who could use a permit, the monitoring requirements as well for any permit. So that brings me to the responsibilities of permit holder. So as I did say before, anyone can apply to be a permit holder. Their responsibilities include complying with the conditions of the permit. So that might be monitoring, reporting or record keeping, and providing any data or information that we need for renewal of those permits. However, it's not up to the permit holder to ensure that anyone who is possibly ever using that permit is complying with it. Ideally, we would not put a permit out there if we didn't think that someone was able to comply with the conditions of the permit. The permit holder is responsible for complying with conditions, but at the same time, all permit users, so anyone using that permit, must comply with those conditions of the permit. The holder's not liable if the conditions aren't complied with by others, but if there is evidence that those conditions can't or won't be complied with, then we might use our powers to vary or cancel that permit. And then just to sum up, just wanted to talk about the timeframes for assessment. So for a new minor use permit or technical changes to an existing permit, so an item 21 application, the timeframe starts at 5 months, but that is a modular assessment. So 5 months is the base timeframe. That could increase to anywhere up to, I think, 13 months, depending on the level of assessment required. Again, that comes back to the data requirements, whether it's a registered or unregistered product, what the specific use pattern is. So this is just a general guideline, but if you do want specific information on how long something would take to assess and what would be required, then I do encourage, again, to apply for pre-application assistance. If you're renewing a permit with no changes, no technical assessment, so that's basically a straight up renewal or any changes that are non-technical administrative, that does not include state extensions. We consider a state extension to be a technical change, so that would be an item 21. But otherwise, if there are no technical changes, that would come in as an item 20, which has a time frame of 3 months. And then for a research permit, the time frame starts at 2 months, but again, that's a modular assessment, so it could increase depending on the level of assessment required. These timeframes can also be extended if we have to ask for further information. So we might issue a formal notice with a timeframe to respond to that, and then the timeframe for the application will subsequently be extended according to the level of assessment required again. So this is basic timeframe, but they may be extended if more information is needed. So that sums up my part of this presentation. We will have time for questions at the end, but for now, I'll hand over back to Jasmine, who will do a walkthrough of our portal.
Thank you so much, Emmy. Very comprehensive, covering a lot of ground there. So there's a lot more detail we could go into, and yeah, we can follow that up in the questions. And after this webinar, if there are particular questions that you have where you need more detail, just let us know. We can help you out there. So I'll just share my screen again. And before we go to some questions, we just wanted to take the opportunity to show you the APVMA Online Services Portal. This portal links to searchable databases where you can actually go in and find the permitted products that are current. And it's also the platform where you would apply for permits, registrations, or any variations of those. So I'll take you to this link and confirm that, yep, we can all see that. So this is the online services portal. There are a few different sections in here, but the three I just wanted to show you today are the product search here, the permit search, and the registration and permit section here. So this first one here, the product search, this is where you can search for registered products. So there are not many of these for aquaculture, but by clicking on here, it's taking you to the APVMA's PubCRIS database, which is a public database where users can go in and search for all of the currently registered products. So I might give you an example here of a product. Basically, you can put in search terms for anything that you're looking for, and provided those keywords match the title of the registration, it will come up. So if I put in aquatic anesthetic, and we scroll down, we can see that 2 have popped up. You can click on the view details section to see more about the particular products. There are a few different sections here which talk about, the package sizes, the labels, what it's to be used on. And then if you click up here on the view label section, you can actually see the details of the label and in PDF copies that you can download and look at. There's various information in there. Hang on, just need to move my... Right, so just a couple of comments about the search functions in here. You do need to have the specific keywords. So we've put aquatic anesthetic in here and you had the 2 products coming up. But if, for example, I had fish anesthetic in there, it actually would not come up with anything. So you do need to know what you're looking for and what the keywords are. And there is another way you can get around this by including like multiple search terms. So if we put fish or aquatic and anesthetic, those sort of combination terms, it can potentially bring up more options and more registered products. There are only 2 that fit in this category for aquaculture, but it gives you the idea of the different ways that you can search this database. And there is got some guidance material that the APVMA have put together, which explains how you can use those search terms to be a bit more targeted in your hunt for particular products. And I will include a copy of that document in the resources that we send out to everyone after this webinar. So yeah, again, if you are looking for a particular registration or a product and you can't find it hunting through here, let me know, because I do have a database of all of the current aquaculture permits and registrations and their titles and use conditions and things. So if you're looking for something and you're struggling to get the right keywords, let me know and I might be able to help you out there. So we'll move on to the next section here, the permit search. So this is looking for all of the current minor use emergency research permits that Emmy was just talking about. So again, we're looking for keywords to put in here, and I just might give you an example of kingfish, see what comes up. Got a couple of products here. So the main things to look for are anything in red is an expired permit. So that's something that has lapsed, but the black permits are the ones that are current. So you can click on these and view the details. And I'll just note here where it says type of permit, vet. This is where it's either a veterinary product or an agricultural product, and it will differentiate which type of permit it is there. So we can click on view and have a look at what one of these minor use permits actually looks like. So we've got your permit number, we've got how long it's in force for, when its expiry date is, who holds the permit, who the suppliers of the product are, who is actually authorised to use it. And in this case, it's licensed yellowtail kingfish farmers under the direction of a registered veterinarian. We'll then describe the specific products that are authorised for use. And you can see here that these are 2 unregistered products. It'll have the approved directions for use and any critical use comments, which are things that have to be followed. Then there's the withholding period, the jurisdictions where it's applicable, and any other comments relevant to the permit. And then there'll usually be a label as well. So if we head back to the home page, covered off on those 2 sections, and the last one I want to talk through is this registrations and permits section here. So this is where you can actually apply for applications and things. So if you go down to the decision tree, that's the first port of call for starting an application. So anyone can go in here, click on this decision tree and start to work through that mapping of what application you need and what information you will need to present for it. So the detail of this will go into in a future webinar, so explaining specifically what types of data you'd need, some examples of that, and a bit of a walkthrough of an actual application. But today I just want to show you here, you've got a couple of options. If you want to apply for a permit, you click on this one here and then follow through the questions and get to the end, in which you'll get what's called a decision ID, and that's a number that you can then take forward in your application and officially lodge the application through this portal here. And the other one I wanted to highlight is the bottom one here, apply for pre-application assistance. And this is one Emmy mentioned. It's a way to get more technical advice from the APVMA around specifically what data you need for your permit application to be successful. There is a fee associated with that, but it is a way in which you can engage with the APVMA and make sure that your application is fit for purpose as it can be before you submit it. And then finally, how do you actually apply and submit an application? So in order to use this component of it, you do need to have an account with through the APVMA Online Services Portal. So to do that, you can click on this link here and it will take you through to the application form that you need in order to do that. And it looks a bit like this. So the various sections that you need to fill in, you email that through to the APVMA and you will be instated as a new user and able to use those different sections of the portal. So a very quick look at the portal, and I can help you with more specifics, as can the APVMA, if you've got any questions. So I'll just leave you with a few things after this webinar so that you've got something to look back on if you've got questions. So we will have a recording of this webinar. You'll have copies of Emmy's presentation and mine, and we'll also give you a copy of that quick reference guide, which is how to use the different search terms in the database, so the and or functions and different ways to get access to those permits. And then finally, a copy of the guidelines for determining minor use. And again, Emmy mentioned this as a document that explains which species are automatically considered minor species and how that justification process is come to. So thank you all for listening. We now have some time for questions. So I might open the floor if you can put your hand up if you've got any questions or if there's anything in the chat. Sure if we've got anything in there, not yet. Hopefully some of you have some questions for us. Can you take it?
Jasmine. Also, I have one. Sorry. Oh no, Nick's got one. Let's go to Nick.
Yes, Nick, you're on mute.
Okay, I've managed to do both things. You mentioned state, what was it called? I can't remember the term, I wrote it down. State extension, does that mean just extending the permit for use in a different state?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think the example permit Jasmine showed before was just for use in South Australia. If, say, they wanted that use in WA as well, then it would be an item 21 application. We'd consider that a state extension to add WA to the jurisdictions where that permit can be used.
Okay, it might need to extend it to Tasmania, although it's Commonwealth waters. So would that, if something was being used in Commonwealth waters, but I think in the case of the proposed Bass Strait operation, I think it's sort of administered through Tasmania, even though it's outside Tasmanian waters. But
yeah, as part of our assessment process, we do have an obligation under our legislation to consult with state coordinators so that they're aware of the proposed use under permit in their jurisdiction and they have an opportunity to comment on the permit application. So yeah, if it did need to be extended to Tasmania, that would be a separate application and we'd consult the Tasmanian state coordinator as part of that assessment.
sure, thanks.
maybe just on the back of that, Emmy, what sorts of things would you be looking for in order to extend a permit to more jurisdictions?
Yep, so we would look for one, we do that state coordinator consultation as I talked about before, but then also that any efficacy, target animal safety, environmental concerns or risk assessments would then be also applicable to the new jurisdiction. So I guess if we're looking at areas with different climates, then we might have questions around, for example, efficacy if a product or like a particular disease is likely to present differently or be harder to treat in certain climates than others. We'd also be looking at environmental factors, so whether there's anything unique about the waters in that particular jurisdiction that would mean that we'd need to do some further assessment. In a lot of cases, it's fairly, I guess, easy to transfer across existing risk assessments to new jurisdictions, but those are the kind of things that we'd consider.
Is it Stephen there?
Yep. Just a quick one. Are there rules or guidelines around the number of specific uses a chemical might have on a single permit? So is there limitations around issuing a permit for something that may be used in the same facility on the same species, but in multiple ways, either destruction, euthanasia, sedation, disinfection? If you had a chemical that was suitable for multiple uses, can they all be included on the same permit?
Yeah. So we do have guidelines around the number of different chemicals on a permit. We generally say up to 5, but that's more in the case of minor use permits that have been renewed and kind of consolidated over time. If we're talking new permits, then we'd prefer like 1 chemical. But in terms of the number of use patterns, it is possible to have different uses on the same permit. The example you're talking about where you are talking euthanasia but also distraction does pose some issues in terms of our legislation, because euthanasia would be considered a veterinary use, whereas distraction might be more in the agricultural use space, depending on exactly what the use pattern is. But often, there are ways that we can still issue a permit, like under the same permit for that. Yeah, so we can basically consider different uses. We can also have different species on the same permit if it's for a similar use pattern. And there's no like hard and fast rule about it, but it's generally within reason. But for most aquaculture uses, they'd probably be similar enough in terms of the risk assessments that we could consider putting them on the same permit.
Okay, thanks.
I have another one if no one else has got any. You mentioned that there are some exemptions in the regulations for particular products maybe not requiring a permit. Is that for things like, I'm thinking like sodium chloride, salt, those sorts of products which may still be used in the treatment of an animal, but they're commonly available and easy to access products? How are those treated?
Yeah, so it depends, I guess, on the claim that's being made. So under our legislation, it defines what a veterinary product is, and if the product is making that claim, whether it be sodium chloride or something that we'd more commonly recognize as a pharmaceutical, then there should be a permit in place for that product. There are, I guess, some nuances when it comes to the state control of use legislation, because the APVMA regulates products up to the point of supply, but the actual control of use is regulated by the states. And there's also some provisions for veterinary prescribing rights there, where something's used under the supervision of a veterinarian prescribed for use on individual facilities. But yes, a lot of the things that come under our legislation as excluded as veterinary products are things where we've had sufficient data and assessment to show that they are generally safe, that we're not expecting, I guess, any detectable residues in an animal as a result of that use. Things like feed additives, digestive supplements, topical treatments for, like, say, hooves or something, are the kind of products that are included in that list.
Okay, thank you.
Jasmine, you've just got a couple of. Oh yeah, you got them.
Yeah, just got those here. So one from James. Does provision of a state or territory DPI endorsement for a proposed chemical permit assist the item 21 application process, or is this not necessary to include?
Yes, it does assist. It helps us, I guess, get a bit of a better picture around what minor use, why there's a need for the product, and that there is genuine need for that in the jurisdiction. We do consult state coordinators anyway for an item 21, but it is helpful. So not strictly necessary, but we do appreciate it, and we appreciate, as much supporting evidence as possible.
And it sounds like you would speak with the state coordinators anyway in order to have the permit issued. So it's doing it the other way around, isn't it? You're sort of getting that approval before the application goes in.
Yeah.
And I have one here from VTran. So thanks for your presentation. And is there a specific guideline for biologics with origin from overseas, e.g. interferon antibodies?
So we don't have a specific guideline. We do have guidelines for biological products, but our guidelines are not specific to biologics from overseas. I believe that would be covered by Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, because that comes under our biosecurity legislation. So they would have guidelines about the requirements for import of those products.
But you would still need a permit to use the product, but the assessment of the import would be dealt with separately.
Yeah, that's an area where I guess there's a lot of overlapping legislation and regulation. So you would need a biosecurity import permit from DAF. You would need a permit from the APVMA to be able to use the permit, to use the product. But you'd also need, if you're importing any AgVet chemical products, you need an APVMA consent to import as well, so that it can come through border control.
Makes sense. Now, we haven't got any other questions in the chat. Does anyone else want to take advantage? We've got Emmy here for another minute. Nothing else? I have one last question then to finish off. Why is GMP requirement not needed for ag products?
Great question. Definitely a can of worms would be open, but I guess the overall picture is just the risk that's involved. So ag products, you're applying it to plants, not directly into an animal. So, for ag products, we do still assess chemistry manufacturer. We want to make sure that the product will meet specifications, but I guess there isn't that stringent level of requirement for safety, for example, for a product that's sterile that you're injecting directly into an animal. So that GMP requirement, I guess, is just there because we have higher standards for animal safety and welfare for veterinary chemical products than we might for something that we're just applying to a plant.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we've come to the end of our time, so thank you all for listening in. As I said, you'll get a copy of the presentations from today and the webinar recording and a few other resources, which we will send out in an email link. But thanks again for joining us today. Hope you've learnt something, and please feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions at all. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar later in the year.